Your point was God uses even conflict to bring about his good purposes. And you made an interesting point that I didn't necessarily think about. Like, yes, these two men go their separate ways, but it actually, God uses it as a multiplier.
Yeah. So God uses this conflict, which is inevitable in a fallen world, to double the work.
Yeah.
I will say this. I think we have evidence to suggest that this conflict was really, really significant. And the language of it is that these two guys were at loggerheads and were pretty upset when they broke apart. I think we can see this as a legitimate, serious conflict that wasn't positive. Apostles, they're not sinless. So even if Paul got a little hot under the collar in this moment in a way that was not positive, and Barnabas too, yes, God used it for his purposes, and it wasn't an irreconcilable thing. Later they did, I think, come back together as brothers.
Welcome to Footnotes. I'm your host, Adam Castellino, and with me, as always, is Pastor Tony Caffey. It's good to see you again, Pastor.
Hey, Adam. Good to see you. Love this passage, man. This is good. Acts 15.
Yeah, so last week we were in chapter 15, a great moment of, I want to say, kind of unity and resolving this intense conflict, really serious conflict. And there was some compromise, but mostly they united under the truth of Scripture. They wrote this letter to help the Gentile believers understand things, and it was really kind of bringing Jews and Gentiles together in this wonderful way. Then we get to the end of chapter 15, and something very different happens.
Yeah, there's complications in this text, and I mean that's the nature of history writing. If I can just comment on this, if everything was hunky dory and there weren't any problems, and the hero always wins, with that's the stuff of fairy tales. That's not really history, and so complications, and we see three of them in the text here. I mean that's life, that's reality, that's history. That lets us know that Luke, as a clear, accurate historian, is conveying these truths, and he thinks it's important to what the story he's telling as well. There were things that they had to work through as a team, conflicts. There were closed doors that obviously got us behind, and wouldn't you know it, those kinds of things happen in our day too. So it's good to see those in the Bible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that essentially Luke is continuing with a trend in Scripture where he's not sugarcoating anything.
Right.
We see that even in Genesis with Noah or David or Moses. You would think if this was all fictionalized, like you said, they would never have any flaws, always doing the right thing. But we see right here two men that are so respected even today by Christians, so appreciated. They were people, and they had such, I mean, in my mind, I can't even fathom why this dispute would be so sharp that they would just break it off.
But you've seen conflict in the church, so
absolutely.
I mean, it's not impossible to believe something like this would happen. I would say, too, in Galatians, we have that example. You and I worked through that when we preached through Galatians, of Peter and Paul getting into it, and Paul was had this case of apostolic apoplexy as he's dealing with not just Peter, him not sitting with the Gentiles, but also Barnabas was in that, which is fascinating to me because that's in the rearview mirror of what we're seeing here in Acts 15 and Acts 16. So that maybe had something to do with this conflict as well.
Yeah, so we see, I mean, you're just wondering how Mark is feeling about all this. Like he's it's like almost like a Yoko Ono moment. Kids, you look that up. Your point was God uses even conflict to bring about his good purposes. And you made an interesting point that I didn't necessarily think about. Like, yes, these two men go their separate ways, but it actually, God uses it as a multiplier because Paul goes kind of northwest, and then Barnabas kind of goes southwest. And so these two great, missionaries, apostles, who did so much before, now they're kind of going off, and we assume they'll continue it, but it's more in a sense.
Yeah. So God uses this conflict, which is inevitable in a fallen world, to double the work.
Yeah.
And okay, so I've seen this even in the modern day world where let's say an associate pastor, or let's just say a pastoral intern even, gets like kind of restless and frustrated. I'm ready to preach. I'm ready to do my own thing. I'm ready to lead. And, the longer they stay in that environment where they're, not using their gifts, it can be frustrating. And so the best thing, and I've seen God work this, is like, okay, let's use the energy of this person, this restlessness, this desire to get off on their own, to multiply the work, to plant a church. We need more churches. Why not do that instead of just building a bigger and bigger church with more and more staff people? So that's a modern day example of where something like this can result in something positive. I will say this, just on both sides, I don't want to sound like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth, but I think we have evidence to suggest that this conflict was really, really significant. And the language of it is that these two guys were at loggerheads and were pretty upset when they broke apart. So I don't think we should minimize that at all, but we do see in the testimony of the New Testament that they continued to work together, to talk back and forth. Paul has a wonderful statement about John Mark in 2 Timothy. He also has a statement about him in Philemon. Barnabas maybe disappears a little bit, but it's not as if this was an acrimonious split where they never were reconciled or anything like that. So I think we can see this as a legitimate, serious conflict that wasn't positive. Apostles, they're not sinless. So even if Paul got a little hot under the collar in this moment in a way that was not positive, and Barnabas too, like, yes, God used it for his purposes, and it wasn't an irreconcilable thing. Later they did, I think, come back together as brothers.
And so this could be a helpful thing for people to work through today, because as a pastor, you've dealt with conflict probably on a pretty regular basis, maybe bigger, some smaller. And like you said, God uses it for good. Maybe the people here, maybe they're in a small group dealing with conflict. Maybe it's a friend in their church. It doesn't have to come to a split, but like, what are some wise insights into managing even if it's just a small conflict between friends?
Good. So conflict is inevitable in marriage. We walked through that in premarital stuff. I'm sure you've dealt with that in the counseling world too, Adam. And the goal in conflict, because it is inevitable, and it's not intrinsically evil either, even though it's a result of a fallen world. I don't think we'll have conflict in eternity, praise God. Yeah. But it's a part of our world now. The goal when you're walking people through like how to manage conflict is use the conflict in your life and your marriage to build a stronger marriage, to build a stronger relationship. Don't in the midst of that conflict do something, horrible. And we have several rules that we, give to married couples, like don't yell, don't throw things, don't enact a passive-aggressive strategy, don't, call each other names. Do the kinds of things that fracture the relationship permanently. But in the midst of a conflict, work it out, talk it out, think it out, pray it out even as to how might God use this conflict, let's say in a marriage, because a marriage, the language used here for Paul and Barnabas it's the same word that's used for divorce. They split.
Yeah.
And, there's nothing intrinsically wrong about that with apostles or these ministries. Married couples can't do that, according to the one flesh union without, some serious problems. So you've got to figure out how to work it out. Now, in a church relationship, maybe a split is necessary in the sense that you've got to go to another church, or, like the example that I gave earlier about an associate pastor, that person maybe needs the conflict, shows the elders like, okay, this person is ready to go off on their own and start their own church and lead their own ministry. And that can be kind of the positive direction. As long as nothing is done in that conflict that permanently, tears up the relationship, or, words get said that, you can't take back later.
Yeah.
So that's just some practical ways to manage it. Let me give those rules again, because those rules are not just good for marriage. It's good for everything. Don't yell, don't call names, don't, enact a passive-aggressive strategy. Don't, assume the worst in people all the time, or try to attribute to them some negative thing when you don't have evidence to that. just little rules like that, I think, will help us conflict well, leading us into a deeper relationship with Christ, instead of conflicting badly, leading to, isolation and depression and sadness and a breaking of the relationship.
Yeah. Well, I think that's very helpful. Because ideally there's reconciliation. And in this particular moment, we don't see them reconciled. There's evidence, like you said, that they probably were later on. They're reconciled now in heaven. But it's comforting to know that there is biblical principles we could employ to see reconciliation. And if it can't be perfect, that it can part on good ways or good terms.
I'll give some other practical advice. And obviously Paul would have known this, Barnabas too. Like the book of Proverbs, I preached an entire series verse by verse through that book. There are so many helpful principles there for managing the tongue, managing our speech in a way that actually builds up relationships instead of tearing them down. So super practical, like get into the book of Proverbs and understand, how to control your speech, or I should say channel your speech in a way that would honor the Lord.
Yeah.
The Apostle James talks about that too in the book of James, the nature of our speech. So those are two good sources for us.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So they go their separate ways. We follow Paul's journey.
Yep.
Because as we see in the next text here, Luke shows up. So he's right there with Paul, knowing what's going on. And very quickly, we see their journey. And there is this very momentous meeting of a young man who becomes so important in Paul's life, of course, Timothy. And you describe something that is shocking at this moment in the narrative. We just established Christians don't need to be circumcised or come under the law to be saved, but now he meets this young man, Jewish mother, Greek father. He wants him to travel with him, preaching the gospel, and he has him circumcised. And so I know you navigated it very well, and you put it under the banner of, well, these are concessions. I think you said what's not required for salvation can be offered up for unity.
Yeah.
So let's elaborate that a little bit today. And you gave examples of things that we can give up under certain circumstances in order to either preach the gospel or foster unity. It's a difficult subject because from one extreme to another, people might veer into legalism, or they might veer into this, I don't know what the term for it is, flaunting their liberty to the point where it becomes even carnal.
Right.
So how do we kind of navigate that and recognize the moments where, this is a time where we need to just make a sacrifice, accept something for the sake of a brother?
It is tough. I think the easiest way to assess what Paul was doing here is he didn't want to get bogged down with this kind of controversy when he's trying to, accelerate gospel witness. And so it's a quick and easy way, maybe not quick and easy for Timothy, but still, like one step, it's done. And now he doesn't have to argue about it. He doesn't have to talk about it. He doesn't have to wrestle through it. He can just go straight to the gospel. He can lead Timothy into the synagogues. I know there's some debate about that. God-fearers could still go into the synagogue uncircumcised. But still, I mean, there, I think, was a barrier there, if not, like they're checking for that at the door. There's still like, you're not one of us, you know, and now he's one of us. And so they're able to speak more directly to the gospel.
Yeah.
And so that concession, that accommodation, I'll use that word too, helped to accelerate gospel opportunities. And Paul was willing to do that as long as it's understood that this is not necessary for salvation. I mean, that's what he wrote the book of Galatians about, really. Yep. That's what they came to that conclusion on in Acts 15. Once we get it removed from the equation of necessary for salvation, now we can offer it up as something to build bridges for the gospel. So it's kind of a fine line. I get it, and it would be great to have Paul as part of this podcast and just, can you explain this to us, Paul? But I think there's enough here for us to try to tease out the reasoning for what he did, why he did it. And, in verse 5, it does talk about the growth of the church. Implicitly, I think Luke is saying, Timothy circumcised actually made a way for Jews to get saved. So why not, in this case, make that concession? Now, how we cross 2,000 years and talk about application. We could go a lot of directions with this, Adam, and think that through. And I think that's a valuable thing, just in a small group environment, or you and I can do it right now, where we think like, okay, how can we accommodate those who might have objections in a way that helps to accelerate the gospel? So Ajith Fernando gave this example, which I thought was great. Sometimes it's easier to think about it in another context than our own. When it's our own, it's like, oh, now you're getting personal. I don't know if I want to do that. But he was talking about in Sri Lanka, where he was a missionary, he would coach some missionaries who go in that environment to actually be vegetarians, to give up their freedom to eat meat, which, I mean, we're in Texas. That's a hard thing.
Whoa.
In order to build bridges with Buddhists in Sri Lanka who struggle with that. And I mean, the same could be true in India and some places where at least publicly you don't do that in order to prevent any kind of barrier. I'll give you another example. We talked through it a little bit in my small group. The idea of head coverings for women. I know that's a super controversial thing, but if a woman in a missionary context in a place like, rural Amish, America, where that's practiced, that might build barriers for the gospel, at least building up the church in those areas, or in very conservative places in the world where head coverings are still something that women do, or their dress is way more modest or kind of traditional than it is here, to accommodate that culture by assuming that dress. I mean, I think that would be a wise course of action, instead of just saying, I'm an American, I don't have to dress, and we don't have to do head coverings, and I've worked that through theology, and just kind of throwing that in the face of the people you're trying to minister. That could be a barrier to the gospel.
Yeah, absolutely. My wife for a time worked overseas, and there were places where she went where she had to change her garment, head coverings, things like that. And if she didn't do that, there'd be no chance that she could have even gone to certain places or even talked to. So it makes a lot of sense when you put in that context, like, and even in America, like you mentioned, in other places. And I would wonder if, like, I was going to like the inner city or very non-religious areas, showing up in a suit and tie and a giant Bible might not ingratiate me.
That's a good example.
Being casual or something, it just eliminates small things that could trip people up. Or I've even wondered, like, what if I was reaching out to like far left hippies? Like, how far would I go? Would I go vegan for them? Probably not. But maybe when I'm with them, I won't be like chomping down on a burger. But like making those concessions. And you even quoted when Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians, just to get, like, it's superficial stuff. I mean, circumcision is such a more dramatic, very intense version of that. Like putting on a head covering, it's not going to be painful.
And it's a once for all time kind of thing too. Whereas some of these other things are.
Yeah, there might not be a perfect analog for us today, and that might be good because we see the most intense case to help edify us today. But I think it's valid in those scenarios, and I do think I agree with you that Paul's doing this so there won't be this stumbling block. And maybe and we know he had other totally Greek Gentile allies who he didn't compel them to do that, like Titus. He's like, I never told him to do that, but because of Timothy's unique background, and he was Jewish because of his mother, it was just he knew he had to take that step. So I want to throw it to our producer Kyle, because he had an insightful question regarding this issue as well.
Yeah, thanks Adam. Yeah, I was thinking about this when you were preaching it on Sunday, and the first passage that came to mind was Galatians 5:2. I'll go ahead and read it just for the context, but it says, "Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again that every man who accepts circumcision, that he is obliged to keep the whole law. If you," and then this is probably the most extreme statement. He says, "You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace." And so I guess my question is, obviously we know Paul knows how to thread this needle, but in Paul's mind, he's seeing that these Galatians who are accepting circumcision are kind of crossing this line. So I have friends who, I guess, follow certain dietary restrictions from the Old Testament. or Jewish traditions and customs, and festivals and Sabbath. They keep Sabbath. They do a lot of this stuff. Now they'll say, kind of what you were saying, that they do it because they minister to the Jewish community, and doing those things kind of alleviates a barrier to talking to them. But I also have friends who will hear that, and then they'll say, well, you also mentioned on Sunday that we shouldn't be, I guess, leaving our Christian brothers in the state where they feel like those things are necessary, even if they're doing it like for the sake of just, ministry stuff. Sometimes these people, the line where they draw, like they feel like it's necessary, not for salvation, but they feel like it is a necessary thing for them to do. Well, I guess, how do we navigate that? At what point are we supposed to be encouraging our brothers to be like, live in freedom, versus they have a particular conviction and we want to allow them to follow out that conviction?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing up Galatians 5. There's a premise intrinsic to that statement about acceptance that has to do with more than just the physical act of being circumcised. Because Paul would say later, circumcision, uncircumcision doesn't mean anything. You can do it, you can't do it, whatever. What he's saying and arguing there is that intrinsic to the circumcision there are people that are thinking, I got to do this to be saved. Mm-hmm. So I think that's built right into that argument. And he's saying, if you do that, if you buy into that, I need at least one work in addition to my faith to get saved, now you can't limit it to one work. It's got to be all the works. It's got to be all of the law. And so he's saying your whole house of cards falls apart the minute you buy into that Jesus plus some other thing in order for salvation. So that's how I would argue how to reconcile Galatians 5 with what's happening here with Timothy. But in order to address your other question, your other statement, and it's really quite practical, because legalism is sneaky. It kind of gets in there, and it's a mind virus. You got to remove where it's like, oh yeah, I need to do this, and these food laws are important, and you can do that, not do it, all you want. Go for it. Whenever your mind twists that into a need to versus could do, that's where the problem. That's where you got to change course.
But you would say need to specifically for salvation.
Correct.
Not need to for the gospel, like to share the gospel. Because that's what I'm saying is like, that's their line, is they say, I need to do this in order to share the gospel. And so you may have some people who interpret that as, no, you don't need to do that. You know what I mean? Like so that's kind of where I'm getting at, is these people may not think that it's necessary for the gospel, but they think it's necessary.
Well, I would argue that Paul it's an ought to, not a need to with Timothy. It's a better than practice to have him circumcised. I don't, again, it'd be great to have Paul on this podcast and ask him, but did you need to circumcise Timothy? My argument is that he would say no. But it was an ought to, it was a advantageous thing. We did it. It helped advance the gospel. Why not if it does accomplish that? Mm-hmm. And so same argument with food sacrifice to idol, or the dietary laws. Food sacrifice to idols is a whole nother thing that we can get into some other time. But yeah, the food laws, or your wife wearing head coverings, great example. Is that a need to or an ought to? Is that a need to or a better than practice? I would say it's a better than practice to do that. Yeah. Just remove these objections. We're delving into the world, and this is fascinating to me. This is what missiologists call contextualization. How far do you take the contextualization in terms of bringing the gospel to another place? I'll just give you some examples of this. And again, I think it's easier to look on the outside. In other cultures, it's a little harder to appropriate in our own world. But in the Muslim world, I know, because I've had conversations with people who are in this world, they elevate the Quran to the highest place in the room. And that's an act of respect. And so with Christian believers, when Muslims get saved, the question is, they want to put the Bible at the highest place in the room as an act of respect to mimic what's done in that Muslim world. Like, is that a need to? No. Is it a good practice? Yeah. showing in that context, I think, that we value the Bible as you do the Quran. And in fact, we see it as the true word of God. And so we accommodate that practice. Another example would be Hudson Taylor. When he went to China, he was ministering to philosophers in China, a lot of who, like Confucian scholars, grew their hair out long and put it in a ponytail, if I remember, which was anathema in British society. You didn't do that as a man, but he did that in order to connect well with Chinese people and to be on their level in a way, an accommodation practice that allowed him to philosophize with them, and then he was able to preach the gospel. And some people might look at on that and say, well, you're bowing to social custom in a way that's unhelpful. Actually, no, I mean, I'm all for that. Now, that gets a little more complicated. The big debate in the missiology world is, we want to be called Muslim background believers, not Christians, because Christians is, that whole term is tainted. So they're called MBBs. We're an MBB. We're a Muslim background believer, similar to the way, a Jewish person might say, I'm a Messianic Jew.
Yeah.
And okay, is that accommodation? Is that going too far? Are you maybe that's where contextualization gets really complex, and we've got to think these things through, reason them through. I guess I want to pivot a little bit, because as fascinating as it is to look out on the other parts of the world and kind of criticize them, I really want to press into like what can we do as Americans in our world to, like Timothy, give up a freedom that we have instead of flaunting it, actually sacrifice willingly in order to lead someone to Christ. I gave a few examples there. We can maybe debate those, but I think it'd be helpful to just think through, like, what are some other ways that we can do that? I'll give an example myself. If somebody really does have an objection to eating meat, let's say that they're a PETA advocate, and that becomes something where I can't converse with them or talk with them, and I'm not going to eat meat in front of them.
Yeah.
But let's get together and talk the gospel. Now, later down the road, I might circle back and say, you know what, this PETA stuff is really kind of silly. Here's why.
Right.
But I don't want to front load my opportunity for evangelism with them. Or if you go and you try to witness to somebody and they're like, you've given this example, what about dinosaurs in the Bible? It's like, okay, let's deal with that later. Right now, let's talk about Christ and keep the main thing the main thing.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes that line is difficult to see when somebody is objecting for something that's like a legitimate like tripping point for them, and sometimes they're just looking for a reason to just bite back. So it's like your example of the dinosaurs thing, that's not really a stumbling block for them. They don't care about the dinosaurs not being in the Bible. They just want to get a gotcha moment. So yeah, I kind of sometimes those things are easy to spot, and other times, like especially when you press them on it and you're like, does this really bother you? Like if I could find the dinosaurs in the Bible, would that make you believe? And then they'll probably be like, no. And it's like, then that's not an issue. Like that's a non-issue.
Yeah.
Yes, but let me show you what you're doing there. You're walking them down reasonably a place of trying to discern, is this a real objection or not? But you might find a real objection in that conversation.
Right. Yeah, it's possible.
Which is like, okay, well, let's not, if you really feel that strongly about it, I won't eat meat or drink alcohol in front of you or whatever. If I need to wear a head covering, I'll bring a hat when I come talk with you. And suss that out in such a way that you can keep moving the gospel conversation forward.
Yeah. That's definitely, I think, in some circles in America, a big problem, because I talked about this a few weeks ago. We let our either political convictions or cultural convictions become so important that we forget we're Christians. Like, this is, I'm going to eat meat in front of you, I don't care, I'll barbecue. And it's like, and I've heard people talk that way who are Christians because it's their hobby horse, it's their soapbox. And it's like, that's not why we're here. Like, you have your convictions, you vote a certain way, you hold on to these cultural things, but that's not going to win someone to Christ. That long-haired hippie that you just laugh at because they're wearing, they're barefoot. This is 1960s, but like, okay, they're so different than you. That doesn't matter in light of eternity. Like, if you can tell them about Jesus, That's more important than like laughing at them because they're, picketing some silly cause. And I think that's the takeaway, at least to a certain extent in America. Like who cares about circumcision, or in America, most likely you're not going to worry about head coverings or this or that. But yeah, maybe you have to like hold your tongue because they said something that they love this person that you hate.
Right.
But that doesn't matter because you're telling them about Jesus, and you want to build a relationship that can lead them to the Christ and lead them to discipleship, and maybe talk about that person later, whoever it might be. So
I feel like some of the examples you gave of like government liberties, I was thinking about that, and to some degree, I agree with you. I was putting this in the context of Paul, and would Paul give up some like civil liberties that he had if it meant more people could hear the gospel? And I think he would. But at the same time, Paul was one of the guys who used his civil liberties to promote the gospel.
Right.
And so when you brought up
that's the key point, to promote the gospel.
Yeah.
Like if it became advantageous to,
like he evoked his right to, appeal his sentencing in order to go before Caesar and preach the gospel. So it's like
sneaky Paul.
Yeah.
Well done.
So I guess my point is to say, don't be in such a hurry to just give up everything. But if there's an opportunity, maybe that is something that's advantageous. Like you mentioned, freedom of speech. Well, really, freedom of speech is one of the reasons why we could even talk about this stuff in our country. So if you say, would you give that up to share the gospel? Well, I would fight to keep it to share the gospel. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, that's good. I had somebody come up to me after the service, and he said, "Thank you for that. Yeah, the freedom of speech thing, like we shouldn't front load all of our conversations with every view we have on everything that might be a stumbling block." But he's like, we also give up our freedom as Christians. We also give up our right to remain silent. Like there's an expectation of us as Christians that we talk and we share our faith with others. And I said, well done, brilliant. And that's the kind of theological reasoning that I really hope this passage stirs in people. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to agree with me on everything that I came away from applicationally here, but come up with your own ways in which you can do like Paul and Timothy here. You can guard the gospel and still at the same time willingly give something up, lay something down, so that somebody might come to Christ.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there's so much we could discuss, but let's move on to the final point since we only have so much time. So.
And that might be the most emotionally challenging of all this. I again had conversations with people just, admitting closed doors in their life, how painful that is. They're pressing for something. They think it's the right thing. They think God's leading this way, and get the door slammed in your face. I mean, that's tough stuff emotionally. And yet we see positively how God used it for good.
And that's what's so encouraging, because we may not have it as dramatically as Paul. Like, I feel like Paul was so intense, it had to be like this, the Spirit of Jesus prevent, like whatever that looked like. It could have been just the Lord saying something. I always, in my mind, my crazy imagination, they're walking to the city and there's just this invisible wall and they're like, come on. And it's probably not like that.
Or Silas's prophet said, the Holy Spirit doesn't want us to go there.
Or some other elaborate thing. But in our lives, it most likely won't look like that. Right. But we face closed doors all the time.
Right.
What's so great about this moment, it kind of condenses the trial. Like ours might last much longer, where it's like closed door, oh, we're going this way. And so it's a reminder, as you said, a closed door, whatever it might be. Sometimes it could be a relationship or a job or a circumstance. And I've known all of us have gone through that. Even in ministry, I know a lot of people who dealt with that. Like, I'm going to reach this country for the gospel, and it just never happens. Right. And God redirected them. But we see it's not some sort of failing on God's part. It's just one of the ways He's directing our steps. And we're going to see next week, of course, what happens next. God had a plan, and it's for the furtherance of the gospel.
And it's great that we get to see God opening the door after He closed doors in a really concise narrative here, because you're right. Sometimes it does drag on for years. You're preaching Job in a few weeks.
Yep.
And there's an example of somebody who went through incredible suffering, and God never tells him why at the end. Not to be a spoiler for what you're going to say, but I mean, that's fascinating to me, because there are times in our lives doors get closed and we don't know. Why did that happen, Lord? Hey, The secret things belong to the Lord.
Yep.
You just be faithful. Trust me that he's getting his purposes accomplished. And that's incredibly practical. Yes,
Yeah.
Lord, okay. I see that. I read that. And now I can see my own experience in painful closed doors. It's like, okay, we're not living in a world that's just random and chaotic and out of control. And you're just, surprised by these things like everybody else. That's not the God who we serve. God knows these things, and God is working those things out for his greater purposes. And we trust that. We can rest in that, Adam. Stories like this really get me fired up about, okay, God has a purpose even in the midst of closed doors. And that's a great takeaway from this passage.
And I think a good reminder would be, the old saying, you can't guide a parked car. Like
that's good.
When a door slams shut, at least for me, like you lose all this momentum and there's that kind of paralysis that might sit in, like, why do I even bother? But like Paul didn't stop. He's like, we can't go there. We can't go there. All right, let's go to Troas and just rest and regroup and consider where's God leading us. He didn't kind of just sit there and go, oh, I guess I shouldn't have preached the gospel, or even like overthink it. Well, this is God punishing me for Barnabas' the fight. Like now I can't preach like who knows where the mind might go. Instead, he's like, all right, let's keep trying. Let's step out in faith again. And sure enough, God says, go to Macedonia. And so in our lives, doors might shut. It might be a sign for some people to slow down and reflect. But for some others, instead of just giving up or getting frustrated, say, okay, what does God have for me instead? There's a season in my life where I was trying to pursue being a published writer. I was real passionate about it. I still am. Never happened because it's very difficult. And unless God opened the doors, it wouldn't happen. But yet God still used my skills as a writer to pursue other things. And it's become a tremendous asset in what I'm doing in ministry and working for the elders. And so I didn't say, well, I'm never going to write again. Forget it. Like, no, God, what do you want to do with this ability you gave me? And had I not spent years writing, I wouldn't have developed a skill that has benefited me so much now. So it's like closed doors result in good things. When we look at it from what this text and what you shared with us means, it's not God's plan, or like you said, maybe not yet, but here's where I'm directing you. So it could be a sign I should slow down and reflect on what God's telling me, but it's always like, don't let that inertia or whatever set in, the apathy or the discouragement. Always say, what's next, God? What is it that I should be pursuing? And it might take time, but God's going to show you.
I like your maxim. That's good. Say it again about the parked car.
You can't direct a parked car.
Yeah. So an object in motion, if I could say it this way, is a lot easier to redirect than an object that's just sitting idly. And I don't think we take away from this, don't do anything until God speaks by his Holy Spirit to you. Like, no, there's an initiative here that was taken. They went out, and yet they were responsive to the Lord when he redirected them.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up this section, Paul's on his way to Macedonia.
Right.
Exciting things are happening. What can we expect?
Don't want to say too much. It's going to be a lot of the stuff we've seen already in terms of positive, negatives, responses to the gospel. But I will say this, the first convert in Europe, not a Jew, not a man. Whoa. Stay tuned for that.
Awesome.
Also, in 2 weeks, just want to plug this as well, you're going to be teaching on the book of Job. So stay tuned for that at messiahbible.org, messiahbible.church. And we won't have footnotes that week, but we will hear from the book of Job from you, Adam.
That's right. Well, thanks again for being here, Pastor. Thanks for listening. And as you heard, check us out at messiahbible.org or messiahbible.church.